What's going on, everybody? Kalipus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you some of my favorite and least favorite things about the Motorola Moto G Power 5G to help you decide whether or not it's the right phone for you. Now, as always, if you do end up wanting to learn more about this phone, be sure to check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So my first pro for the Motorola Moto G Power 5G is the display. Now with this phone, we're getting a 6.5-inch 120Hz IPS LCD display with a 1080p resolution, a PPI of 405, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. So in general, in pretty much every way, we are getting a really good display here. At 6.5 inches, it may not be the largest display out there, but it definitely is large enough to give you a pretty good experience in really anything you might be doing. If you're going to be doing stuff like reading or web browsing, for example, things are going to show up pretty well here. With a 20:9 aspect ratio, we're also getting a pretty tall and narrow form factor. So if you're in landscape mode, maybe watching a video or looking at photos, for example, you're going to get a nice immersive experience. Things are going to look a bit more cinematic, and then the scrolling experience is going to be good too. So in general, the size and dimensions are great, and the image quality is really good too. With the 1080p resolution, we're getting a nice sharp, crisp image. The colors and brightness overall are pretty good, and despite the viewing angles really not being the best, in a normal indoor setting at least, they are definitely okay. And with the 120Hz refresh rate, the movement on the screen is a bit faster and smoother, making the phone feel a bit more premium to use. So overall, if you are looking for a phone that has a really nice display, you're definitely not going to go wrong with this phone. My second pro for the Moto G Power 5G is the storage. Now keep in mind, this phone in my hand is the factory unlocked version you get directly through Motorola, and if you get this phone through a US carrier, the storage may be different. But with this phone in my hand, we're getting 256GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so this is definitely a ton of storage, especially considering at full price, this phone is going for around $299, and depending on when you get it and where you get it from, you may end up paying quite a bit less. So for such an affordable device, getting this much storage is really impressive. So if you're someone who's constantly downloading apps and games and stuff like that, or even just an average user for that matter, if storage is more of a priority for you, the Moto G Power 5G will be a great choice. My third pro for the Moto G Power 5G is the processor. Now with this phone, we're getting 6GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 930 processor. Now first of all, as the name suggests, this is a 5G phone, so with a 5G phone, of course, you're getting access to the carrier's latest and greatest network, and seeing that 5G is really the future now, any upgrades to the network is really going to go towards the 5G network. So although you can technically survive with a 4G phone at this point, I feel like in 2023, 4G is really becoming less and less relevant. So if you're getting a new phone, you might as well get a 5G phone. So I am definitely happy to see a Moto G Power phone that actually has 5G connectivity. Aside from just having 5G connectivity, the actual performance on this phone is really good too. Now, don't get me wrong, if you're coming from something like a Samsung Galaxy S10, for example, or really any older flagship phone, it still might feel like a downgrade because keep in mind, this is more of a budget option, but at the same time, for average daily use, if you're doing stuff like web browsing, social media, streaming content like videos and music, playing a few mobile games here and there and stuff like that, you will get a pretty good experience here. Now I did run a benchmark test on this phone using Geekbench 6, and here are the results I got. Now what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and then comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of whether or not this phone's going to be an upgrade for you, because of course, depending on what you currently have, it may or may not be. Again, if you're coming from an older but higher end device, chances are it might be a bit of a downgrade, and even if you're coming from something like a Motorola Moto G Stylus 5G 2022, for example, it may not necessarily be a downgrade, but the performance difference between something like this and something like that is honestly pretty small. So considering that you're spending money on a new phone, in that case you might want to get something a bit higher end, because depending on your needs and preferences, making a lateral move in performance may or may not be the best choice either. But again, in general, I feel like for what it is, considering this is a really affordable device, the performance we're getting with this phone is definitely impressive. My fourth pro for the Moto G Power 5G is the software. Now with this phone, we are getting Android 13, so definitely great there. And considering at this point in 2023, I feel like Motorola's software support in general has been getting at least a bit better. While I don't think it's going to have 4 major updates like Samsung's and Google phones, I do think this phone will at least get Android 14, if not maybe 15 beyond that. And in general, if you're someone who's not really keeping your phone for longer than maybe a year or two, and you really just want the latest version of Android and maybe one major update, in that case I feel like this phone is perfectly fine. And again, we are getting Android 13 here, which is the latest version of Android. So right now, when it comes to the software, I really have no complaints here. And as far as how things run, things are pretty smooth here. So having a really good software combined with a really nice processor, for most people, using using this phone will be a real nice experience. And then finally, my 5th pro for the Moto G Power 5G is the camera. Now with this phone, to give you a quick rundown of the camera features, up front here, we got a 16 megapixel selfie camera. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So in general, definitely a good camera setup here. And aside from having a decent amount of features, the photo quality here, as you might expect from a 50 megapixel camera, is really good too. To give you an idea of what it can do, here's some pictures taken with the Moto G Power 5G. And of course, if you're coming from, again, an older but higher end device, this may not really seem that impressive because after all, despite being impressive for what it is, the Moto G Power 5G is still really more of an affordable entry-level phone. So yeah, if you're expecting something even close to flagship quality, you might be disappointed, but honestly, in general, I feel like for everyday practical use for most people, the camera here will get the job done just fine. So if you're taking pictures for something like Instagram, for example, really this camera will be plenty good enough for that. And then stuff like Snapchat, Twitter, sending photos to friends and family, things like that. In general, for things most people are typically using smartphone cameras for nowadays, again, this camera is really going to be plenty good enough. So if you are looking for a more affordable 5G phone that has a nice camera, the Moto G Power 5G will be a great choice. But now that we've gone over some of the good things about this phone, let's talk about some potential drawbacks. So my first con for the Moto G Power 5G is that it doesn't have NFC. Now this is a really big drawback to me because at this point in 2023, at least in the US, I want to say almost every store you're going to walk into has some sort of tap and pay. And unfortunately without NFC, you can't use tap and pay. And even though I know not every person uses it, at this point I feel like every phone should at least have the option to use it, because even if you don't use it now, maybe you might want to try it later. And of course, if your phone doesn't have NFC, then you can't even do that. So in general, unless you never use it and you don't see yourself ever using it, keep in mind again, this phone does not have NFC. So if you do ever want to use tap and pay, you will want to get something else. And I can tell you, when it comes to 5G phones, pretty much every other 5G phone besides this and maybe a couple older blue phones is going to have NFC. So honestly, finding a replacement to this phone that does have NFC is definitely not going to be hard. My second con for the Moto G Power 5G is the materials. Now, on one hand, don't get me wrong, I really do like this design. It looks nice and sleek and modern, and I especially like the back. The back has this nice kind of frosted matte finish that really doesn't pick up fingerprints, and that's something I really appreciate. But at the same time, keep in mind this phone is made entirely of plastic, and not only this, it doesn't really have a whole lot of weight to it. So in general, despite not really feeling cheap, I feel like if you drop this phone, even compared to other phones made of similar materials, I feel like this phone just won't fare nearly as well. And while obviously I don't know about you, but most people are probably not planning on dropping their phone anytime soon, but things do happen, and especially if you're in an environment where maybe you work outside, for example, and you're more prone to dropping your phone somewhere, in that kind of situation, or really in any situation for that matter, I do recommend getting a case for this phone, because with a device like this, it definitely will make a difference. My third con for the Moto G Power 5G is that it can't record 4K videos. So yeah, with this phone, video recording does max out at 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, and while on one hand this is really not surprising at all, if you're coming from an older, higher end device that can record 4K videos, or maybe just a phone that's kind of an anomaly like the Motorola Moto G Stylus 2021, at least the 4G version could record 4K videos, which was definitely not expected. But if you are coming from a phone like that that's a bit older, just keep in mind when it comes to video recording, almost every phone like this is going to max out at 1080p. So if you do want to record videos in 4K, you will have to spend a bit more and get something a bit higher end. My fourth con for the Moto G Power 5G is that it doesn't have an ultra-wide camera. Now when it comes to the camera setup, this is really the main complaint I have here, because on one hand, for a phone like this, it's definitely not the only one that doesn't have an ultra-wide camera, but at the same time, an ultra-wide camera is such a common, popular feature, and I've seen $100 phones that have one. So considering this, I feel like at this point in 2023, really any phone should have an ultra-wide camera. But again, unfortunately, this phone doesn't for whatever reason. So just keep in mind, if you do like to get those wider angle photos, then you will want to get something else. And then finally, my fifth con for the Moto G Power 5G is that it doesn't have wireless charging. Now this is probably the least important thing on this list, because after all, very few non-flagship phones have wireless charging anyway. But just be aware, I know some people get a phone like this expecting it to have wireless charging, so yeah, this phone does not have it. And honestly, I feel like it's really too bad. It would be really nice to see lower end phones starting to get it. I know some phones like the Visible Midnight or the old Cricket Dream 5G and some blue phones, some of them do have wireless charging, but it's definitely not a common thing when it comes to entry level and mid-range phones. And it is a really nice feature to have. Sure, it doesn't really change anybody's life or habits or anything, but in general, being able to just stick your phone on a wireless charger, or even better when you're traveling, having the option to use a wireless battery pack instead of having to carry a bulky charger in your pocket definitely does make a difference. So while on one hand wireless charging again is definitely not like a game changer for most situations, it is a feature I'm definitely hoping to see more of in lower end phones in the future. But those were my pros and cons for the Motorola Moto G Power 5G. In general, despite a few more or less kind of minor drawbacks, I do think this is a great device, and it is definitely worth considering if you're looking for an entry-level 5G phone. Now once again, if you want to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalibus Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next video.